Bismillah, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. My name is Pushpa Bakri Devadasan, and the title of my thesis is The Consciousness and Memories of Malaysian Journalists Who Cover Wars. It is a study about the war memories of Malaysian journalists who report from the front lines, which have been shaped by their multi-levels of affiliations. This study takes a multidisciplinary approach in its analysis, building upon discourse about journalism, memory, and the consciousness of Malaysian journalism. My motivation to study Malaysian war reporting began from the lack of documentation and scholarly work available on the subject. More importantly, it was my fascination for the courage and dedication displayed by a handful of Malaysian journalists who report from faraway war locations, of whom I was privy to during my stint as a broadcast journalist. The years of curiosity had triggered me to investigate the world of Malaysian journalists from within. Malaysian journalists have been reporting from distant war locations for more than half a century, yet there is a dearth of literature on the subject as it remains an under-researched area of investigation. This study gives an empirical focus on non-Western journalists in a scholarship that is growing exponentially and inundated by the Anglo-Eurosphere by Western scholars about Western war correspondence. Between February 2015 to February 2016, this study excavated the oral testimonies of 5 policymakers, 7 news managers, and 25 Malaysian journalists spanning a period of 7 decades ever since the Malayan emergency until the Arab conflicts of the 21st century. What the journalists remembered, how they remembered, and why they remembered the way they do were influenced by their multi-levels of affiliations. Their war memories were shaped and constructed by religious affiliations, national affiliations, professional affiliations, and media organizational affiliations, as well as gender affiliations, ethnic affiliations, and their affiliation with the non-Western world. In the findings, 4 major themes emerged through the memories of the journalists. The growth of Malaysian war reporting unraveled, the identities of journalists revealed, the ethics of the journalists exposed, and the profession of the journalist surfaced. Among the significant findings of this research are as follows. Malaysian journalists' memories of their own wars were incomplete and fragmentary. Historically, the local journalists were deprived of covering their own wars, the Malayan emergency and confrontasi. The British and subsequently the post-independence government imposed 3 mechanisms of control through media censorship, media ownership, and accreditation of journalists to the army, which were reserved for journalists from Western countries who were affiliated to the British. Such mechanisms of control served to silence local journalists and stifle criticisms against the inhumane and secret conduct of the wars. Kept at a discreet isolation, local journalists were ignorant of their own wars, while their British, Australian, and New Zealand counterparts were able to produce abundant recollections of the wars from the jungles of Malaya and Borneo. The censorship functioned to cripple the nationalist movements, which were spearheaded by journalists. During the Malayan emergency, Harry Miller was a prominent name that consistently appeared on bylines of the war reportage in the Straits Times, while other bylines were kept anonymous. The findings of this thesis suggest that Miller was a British agent who served to the tactics of winning hearts and minds of the people. However, through his works, Miller is known until today as the historian who wrote about the Malayan emergency. Subsequently, confrontasi saw the local journalists begin to witness events firsthand. Yet, their war memories were questionable. when findings presented in this research suggest that some of the events witnessed by local journalists were politically orchestrated. The journalists' identities were constructed along their multi-levels of affiliations. When their identities as Malaysians were revealed at distant war locations, regardless whether they were Chinese, Indian or Malay journalists, they were at an advantage compared to their Western counterparts. They were granted ease of access, provided with confidential information, given access to secret locations, and maneuvered themselves out of life-threatening situations, as testified by their numerous gunpoint encounters in Iraq, Bosnia, Iran, and during the Arab conflicts. The Malaysian journalists were considered as friends of the downtrodden and highly trusted by the belligerents of war, whether they were insurgents or civilians. At the war locations, the name Malaysia was often famously associated to Dr. Mahathir's dynamic leadership. Mahathir was not seen as merely a statesman, but rather an institution in the memories of the people at the front lines.
Then when the guy said, "Good, are you Muslim?" I said, "Muslim." And he said, "Tilawah?" I said, "Yes, Tilawah." He remembered about we have every year that Quran recital competition, Tilawah. That's what, then he said, "Mahathir?" I said, "Yes, Mahathir." "Good," he said. When he said good, only then the house, the owner of the house came out and took away my jacket because it was blood there.
And they tried to steal my camera, putting a gun in my head. So I just used the word Sahafi Malazi. I'm a journalist from Malaysia. He said, "Malazi?" I said, "Yeah, Malazi." Then he said, "Proton." I said, "Yeah, Proton." Then he said, "Muhammad Mahathir." I said, "Yeah." Then he hugged me. So I was saved by Mahathir Mohamad.
Policymakers declared that war reportage by Malaysian journalists had an extent influenced Malaysia's foreign policies. This thesis challenges the ideals of Western journalism, particularly the tenet of objectivity that lies at the heart of scholarly discourse on war reporting. What makes the Malaysian war journalists different from Western war correspondents is that the Malaysian journalists aspire to truth as their professional ethics, while at the same time conscious of objectivity as incompatible to their fitra, their innate moral inclinations as compassionate beings. They denounced and reject objectivity as a false conscious ideal designed by the West to achieve malicious intent. Their quest for truth becomes a means to attain justice. Driven by their fitra, there were numerous recollections of how they put aside their professional outfit to relieve the sufferings of innocent women and children. They expressed no hesitation to let their humanity play its role. The doctrine of objectivity that is in conflict with human nature of fitra only serves to distance war journalists from reporting the heart and truth of wars. When the fitra is corrupted by man-made ideals such as objectivity, man's moral conscience will be distressed. The Malaysian war journalists instinctively conduct their routines on two foundations: the foundations of their profession and their social memory as the other. Their past working experiences help them make preparations, hire fixers, invest in reliable sources, identify news of value, and utilize technology within their reach. However, their social memory as the other causes them to take it upon themselves to privilege the voices of those ignored by the international media, giving a voice to the voiceless, says Amy Chu. They told stories of insurgents, civilians, humanitarian workers, anti-war protectors, and other silenced voices. Why they do so is rooted in their social consciousness as the other. The socio-cultural binary of us and them is not a given. It is created historically during processes of nation building that locate the West versus the Self as the other. Tun Dr. Mahathir's engagement with the West played a significant influence. This research concludes that Malaysian journalists are significant players in the competing discourse of war memories. At times, their recollections pose a challenge to the dominant narratives of war manufactured by Western media and popular culture. In a short span of time, the Malaysian journalists have institutionalized the Malaysian war reporting profession by adopting conventions native to them. However, by these conventions, they unconsciously serve to complement and magnify the sagacity of specific wars promoted by Western news agenda. It is my ardent wish that policymakers, as well as practitioners, benefit from this thesis to make more well-informed decisions. With that, thank you.